So the blog evolved from a set of photographs that I began to write about, and that led to going back and sort of exploring further and actually unearthing things that weren't in the original photographs. So perhaps it moved more from being a straightforward blog to being more about the objects that I was looking at. There's things like plans and photographs and printed matter and bits of memorabilia. I'd called it the Museum of Dad when it was a blog. And I became interested in looking at it as though it were, literally a museum, and how would that, be manifest? How would you display that? How would you show it? And also it was a way of sort of mirroring the room. The room, it's a space, it's a three-dimensional space that when you went into and things are there. So would you recreate that, or how would you make a facsimile of it? What would that look like? Or and inevitably you start to think about editing it, and that gives you different sort of narratives and ways of thinking about it. So it just feels like an evolving idea. I took the photographs before we had the diagnosis, actually, and so it was almost like the room itself was telling us that something quite odd was happening. And I think since then, as the Alzheimer's has progressed quite rapidly, this project has allowed discussions to happen about, what early signs, for example, strange behaviours, helps you connect into the person that Dad was, and understand how changes had happened. People have been in touch with me to talk about similar experiences as a result of me doing the blog, and that's been really nice to connect up with other sort of shared experiences. And I was talking recently to somebody who said, there's going to be a lot of this stuff about soon. There's going to be a lot of adult children with, very frail parents making work about that as a thing. So they might be right. There might be a lot of it about to kick off. It's been a good thing in terms of making this exhibition happen. I think as a backdrop, there's a lot of stuff going on to do with architecture and design and innovation. My dad was an architect, and a lot of the content of the room, a lot of the stuff in his files and on his walls, all related to his interest in architecture and his architectural practice. So looking at the objects that will be in the exhibition, they have the sort of look and feel of architect stuff, some of them, because there are sort of blueprints and there are images of Corbusier buildings that were postcards from the 1960s. So I think in terms of the look and feel of it, there's a lot of architectural, modernist design, bit of brutalism thrown in there as well. And some of the stories that emerged came about through remembering my dad's sort of anecdotes about working as an architect in London in the 60s. And he worked for some very prominent names at the time who are still sort of quite influential, and there's a resurgence now of interest, I think, in modernist architecture and in what we call brutalism, and sort of, how it was a utopian project that perhaps failed to some extent, but there's still a lot to learn from that. So some of the new sort of practices, and for example Assemble, who won the Turner Prize, are referencing some of that work, very strong modernist aesthetics. So it's been interesting to go back and find that my dad's stories of working, for example, for Dennis Lasdon in the 60s can be corroborated by stuff in the room. There's a big pile of plans of one of Lasdon's buildings. So that's nice to sort of know that the anecdote has become real through the objects. And he worked for another company called Powell and Moya, who built the Skylon on the South Bank for the Festival of Britain, amongst other things. And one of his stories was remembering when they were moving offices in the 60s, and somebody found this great big ball bearing in a drawer in the office, and this had been the ball bearing that the Skylon had sat on, because it was sort of was suspended as if it was just floating in space. But then, of course, there is a bunch of paranoia stuff in his cupboard that I have plans that he worked on when he worked for them. So that kind of process of, I suppose, reconnecting to his architectural practice has been really interesting as well. And looking at these buildings and thinking about them. And I've been doing a little bit of work to do with the Architecture Festival anyway, with a different hat on. So just these kind of rather nice connections have been formed. But for me, it's more about what the objects tell us about someone, and can you sort of see someone more clearly through the objects they choose to keep around them, particularly when they are becoming very absent. The objects have a much stronger sort of presence about them. So that was what I was interested in kind of thinking about with the project, I suppose. And I'm not sure that curation has come into this in a big way. Well, so this was a series of very just nice sort of tangential coincidences with starting the blog and thinking about objects and meaning and how objects represent people and how objects can allow you to understand stories and narratives of people in their past, potentially more clearly. And I was thinking about things like that when we found ourselves on holiday last year in Istanbul for a week and walked past a sign on a corner that said the Museum of Innocence, and I thought, what is that? That triggered something. And back at the apartment there was a big thick book, Nobel Prize winning piece of literature called The Museum of Innocence, that of course is a novel by Orhan Pamuk, who is an Istanbul based author. And within this book, which I've subsequently read, there's a protagonist who is obsessed by a woman that he can't have, essentially. And what he does instead is he collects objects that she has been associated with, that he's gifted to her or that she's touched, and he creates a collection around her, the idea of her, and ultimately makes it into a museum. So not only is it the description within a novel of a man creating a museum of objects about a person, but there's also a literal museum in Istanbul which you can go and visit, and within this museum all these objects exist that are referenced in the novel. So this is a very interesting project, completely fictitious of course, it's not about a real person, but I just felt there was a sort of resonance there in terms of objects associated with a person who's no longer there, recreating something about them, and retain the sort of the personality that is now lost. Enjoy some of the writing, because while the subject matter is, it's serious and there's an element of sadness to it, there's also some quite humorous anecdotes within the writing. I think there's a quality to the objects and to some of the material that will be on show that just makes them sort of quite intrinsically interesting. I want them to enjoy perhaps the way that connections are made between objects and stories, and the personality of my father, I hope will come through. I think it's quite touching. I think they might be moved by some of it, because it is personal as well. I've presented it as a more sort of universal thing for the exhibition, perhaps editing out some of the very directly anecdotal stuff. So I hope it has a sort of a relevance beyond my sort of immediate family, to people who are perhaps experiencing similar things. They may just allow people to understand that a lot of people are experiencing dementia and Alzheimer's in many different ways and dealing with it in different ways, but there are lots of commonalities within that as well that it's really good to share. And certainly writing the blog has allowed me, I think, to understand that. I think there are definitely some ideas that have come out of this that I'd like to develop in other ways. whether it's more sort of writing or more to do with exhibiting, making, collecting. But nothing concrete at the moment. This is the concrete thing at the moment. I didn't ever think it would become so concrete actually, so we'll see how that goes.